"I failed society, I failed my family, and I failed Ellie's family," Strauss said before he was
Tam Weik
sentenced.
is haunted by her
And
daughter's
most of all, I failed Ellie.
alive.
She
I
thinks
don't
about the
expect
fear and
forgiveness.
horror Ellie Weik must have felt, looking at her murderer through plastic with tape around her neck and wrists. As she took her last breaths, Tam Weik said Wednesday in a Butler County courtroom. Michael Strauss, with his breath, admitted to killing Ellie last month. Tam Weik continued during her victim impact statement in which she implored Butler County Common Pleas Judge J. Gregory Howard to sentence her daughter's killer to the maximum allowed time in prison. Howard obliged. He ordered Strauss to spend 17.5 years behind bars for stalking, murdering, and grossly abusing Ellie Weik's corpse. Accounting for credit for time served, Strauss will be eligible for parole in 2036 and again in 2041 if necessary. Before Howard meted out punishment for Strauss, the 30-year-old man spoke before Howard and the dozens of others who piled into the courtroom, some wearing tie-dye in a nod to Weik's preference for the style. Strauss vowed he wasn't going to make excuses or beg for forgiveness. "Please believe me from the bottom of my heart that I never wanted to hurt anybody," he said. "If there was any way to bring Ellie back, I would trade places with her in a second." Strauss, with two black eyes and tears streaming down his cheeks, nodded very slightly and looked downward as Ellie Weik's father spoke of forgiveness. "My God tells me to forgive," David Weik said. "But he doesn't say when, and I don't know if I'll ever get to that." Strauss's mother, in her own address to the court, said she has heartfelt sympathy for Ellie Weik's family. Tam Weik, after asking for the maximum punishment, said, "My prayer is that his life sentence is never shortened by parole, that he experience his life in prison as long as we experience our lives without Ellie." At stake in Wednesday's sentencing were 2.5 years of time in prison, accounting for whether Strauss's punishment for the two lesser crimes would run during his prison time for murder or apart from it. Howard ruled incarceration for those crimes would run apart, lengthening the period before parole eligibility from 15 years to 17.5. The judge said he considered the manner in which Strauss disposed of Ellie Weik's body and his conduct up to the time of her death in imposing the maximum prison sentence. Howard called it unfortunate that Strauss's case did not qualify for life in prison without the possibility of parole. He did not impose financial penalties against Strauss, who faced a maximum $22,500 in fines across the three crimes, but he did order Strauss pay court costs. Ellie Weik was 23 years old when she disappeared last summer. Her remains were discovered nearly a month later in a field near Strauss's Liberty Township home. He was arrested 1 day later. Strauss was indicted on 9 charges in September, including stalking Weik over an approximately 7-month period, ending on July 29, the last time anyone heard from Weik. As part of a plea agreement, 6 of the initial charges against Strauss were dismissed, including tampering with evidence and theft. Months before her disappearance, in April, Weik reported to Westchester police that someone was sending masked messages to her phone. One message included a video of Weik taken by the sender from outside her house. Hannah Buchanan, Weik's friend since childhood, was critical of the police department's response to Weik's report. "They were always saying, 'We're doing our job. We were doing what we were supposed to do,'" Buchanan said. "And they were, but the thing was that wasn't enough." Within 5 days of receiving Weik's report, Westchester police dispatched an officer to her house on 2 occasions. Each time, the officer conducted a search. According to police records obtained by the Inquirer, the cumulative time spent on the searches: 5 minutes. Lieutenant David Tiven with Westchester Police declined to comment when asked if Weik's phone was analyzed before she disappeared in an effort to identify her stalker, citing Strauss's pending sentencing. Michael Strauss. Tam Weik said the family granted police access to their phone records. "With today's difficulties getting communication and rights, it took them quite some time to get information on where the messages were coming from," Tam Weik said. Still, the department, over a 5-year period ending in 2018, received 87 stalking reports. In a search of more than 100,000 Butler County criminal case records, the Inquirer found that just 4 men investigated by Westchester police were ultimately convicted of stalking over the same period. No stalking convictions were obtained in 2017 or 2018. Westchester police did file 13 stalking charges against adults, But the majority of those charges were modified, dismissed, or, in one case, unresolved because the defendant fled the area. 3 juveniles were also charged. More than a third of the initial 87 stalking reports were closed due to investigative leads drying up. 25 were cleared because prosecutors declined the case. Victims chose not to cooperate, or the case was transferred under what's known as a referral, which requires a victim to present their case before a magistrate, Tiven said. The number of stalking calls received by Westchester police may be higher. Weik's case was classified not as stalking, but as telecommunication harassment before she was killed. A 2012 study conducted by several universities found that stalking preceded 3 out of 4 intimate partner homicides in which a woman was the victim. Stalking is a homicide in slow motion, said Patrick Brady, an assistant professor of criminology with the University of West Georgia who is studying the investigation and prosecution of stalking. I failed society, I failed my family, and I failed Ellie's family, Strauss said before he was sentenced. And most of all, I failed Ellie. I don't expect forgiveness.